Learn English through stories E46 PDF. Adapted and modified by Kulwant Singh Sandhu. Contents: 1. Tiger, tiger, burning bright. 2. Grammar page. 1. Tiger, tiger, burning bright. By Ruskin. On the left bank of the Ganga, where it emerges from the Himalayan foothills, there is a long stretch of heavy forest. There are villages on the fringe of the forest, inhabited by bamboo cutters and farmers, but there are few signs of commerce or pilgrimage. Hunters, however, have found the area an ideal hunting ground during the last 70 years, and, as a result, the animals are not as numerous as they used to be. The trees, too, have been disappearing slowly, and as the forest recedes, the animals lose their food and shelter and move on further into the foothills. Slowly, they are being denied the right to live. Only the elephant can cross the river. And 2 years ago, when a large area of the forest was cleared to make way for a refugee resettlement camp, a herd of elephants, finding their favorite food, the green shoots of the bamboo, in short supply, waded across the river. They crashed through the suburbs of Haridwar, knocked down a factory wall, pulled down several tin roofs, held up a train, and left a trail of devastation in their wake until they found a new home in a new forest which was still untouched. Here they settled down to a new life, but an unsettled, wary life. They did not know when men would appear again, with tractors, bulldozers, and dynamite. There was a time when the forest on the banks of the Ganga had provided food and shelter for some 30 or 40 tigers, but men in search of trophies had shot them all, and now there remained only one old tiger in the jungle. Many hunters had tried to get him, but he was a wise and crafty old tiger who knew the ways of men, and he had so far survived all attempts on his life. Although the tiger had passed the prime of his life, he had lost none of his majesty. His muscles rippled beneath the golden yellow of his coat, and he walked through the long grass with the confidence of one who knew that he was still a king, even though his subjects were fewer. His great head pushed through the foliage, and it was only his tail, swinging high, that showed occasionally above the sea of grass. In late spring, he would head for the large Jeel, the only water in the forest, if you don't count the river, which was several miles away, which was almost a lake during the rainy season, but just a muddy marsh at this time of the year. Here, at different times of the day and night, all the animals came to drink: the long-horned sampar, the delicate chital, the swamp deer, the hyenas and jackals, the wild boar, the panthers, and the lone tiger. Since the elephants had gone, the water was usually clear, except when buffaloes from the nearest village came to wallow in it, and then it was very muddy. These buffaloes, though they were not wild, were not afraid of the panther or even of the tiger. They knew the panther was afraid of their massive horns, and that the tiger preferred the flesh of the deer. One day, there were several sampars at the water's edge, but they did not stay long. The scent of the tiger came with the breeze, and there was no mistaking its strong feline odor. The deer held their heads high for a few moments, their nostrils twitching, and then scattered into the forest, disappearing behind a screen of leaf and bamboo. When the tiger arrived, there was no other animal near the water. But the birds were still there. The egrets continued to wade in the shallows, and a kingfisher darted low over the water, dived suddenly, a flash of blue and gold, and made off with a slim silver fish, which glistened in the sun like a polished gem. A long brown snake glided in and out among the water lilies and disappeared beneath a fallen tree which lay rotting in the shallows. The tiger waited in the shelter of a rock, his ears pricked up for the least unfamiliar sound. He knew that it was at that place that men sometimes sat up for him with guns, for they coveted his beauty, his stripes, and the gold of his body, his fine teeth, his whiskers, and his noble head. They would have liked to hang his skin on a wall, with his head stuffed and mounted, and pieces of glass replacing his fierce eyes. Then, they would have boasted of their triumph over the king of the jungle. The tiger had encountered hunters before, so he did not usually show himself in the open during the day. But of late he had heard no guns, and if there were hunters around, you would have heard their guns, for a man with a gun cannot resist letting it off, even if it is only at a rabbit or at another man. And besides, the tiger was thirsty. He was also feeling quite hot. It was March, and the shimmering dust haze of summer had come early. Tigers, unlike other cats, are fond of water, and on a hot day will wallow in it for hours. He walked into the water, in amongst the water lilies, and drank slowly. He was seldom in a hurry when he ate or drank. Other animals might bolt down their food, but they are only other animals. A tiger is a tiger. He has his dignity to preserve even though he isn't aware of it. He raised his head and listened, one paw suspended in the air. A strange sound had come to him on the breeze, and he was wary of strange sounds. So he moved swiftly into the shelter of the tall grass that bordered the Geel and climbed a hillock until he reached his favorite rock. This rock was big enough both to hide him and to give him shade. Anyone looking up from the Geel would have thought it strange that the rock had a round bump on the top. The bump was the tiger's head. He kept it very still. The sound he heard was only the sound of a flute, rendered thin and reedy in the forest. It belonged to Ramu, a slim brown boy who rode a buffalo. Ramu played vigorously on the flute. Shyam, a slightly smaller boy, riding another buffalo, brought up the rear of the herd. There were about 8 buffaloes in the herd, and they belonged to the families of the 2 friends, Ramu and Shyam. Their people were Gujars, a nomadic community who earned a livelihood by keeping buffaloes and selling milk and butter. The boys were about 12 years old, but they could not have told you exactly, because in their village, nobody thought birthdays were important. They were almost the same age as the tiger, but he was old and experienced while they were still cubs. The tiger had often seen them at the Geel, and he was not worried by their presence. He knew the village people would do him no harm as long as he left their buffaloes alone. Once, when he was younger and full of bravado, he had killed a buffalo, not because he was hungry, but because he was young and wanted to try out his strength. And after that, the villagers had hunted him for days, with spears, bows, and an old muzzleloader. Now he left the buffaloes alone, even though the deer in the forest were not as numerous as before. The boys knew that a tiger lived in the jungle, for they had often heard him roar, but they did not suspect that he was so near just then. The tiger gazed down from his rock, and the sight of 8 fat black buffaloes made him give a low, throaty moan. But the boys were there. Besides, a buffalo was not easy to kill. He decided to move on and find a cool, shady place in the heart of the jungle where he could rest during the warm afternoon and be free of the flies and mosquitoes that swarmed around the Geel. At night he would hunt. With a lazy, half-humorous roar, "Ayun!" he got up off his haunches and sauntered off into the jungle. Even the gentlest of the tiger's roars can be heard half a mile away, and the boys, who were barely 50 yards away, looked up immediately. "There he goes," said Ramu, taking the flute from his lips and pointing it towards the hillocks. He was not afraid, for he knew that this tiger was not interested in humans. "Did you see him?" "I saw his tail just before he disappeared. He's a big tiger." "Do not call him tiger. Call him uncle or Maharaja." "Oh, why?" "Don't you know that it's unlucky to call a tiger a tiger? My father always told me so. If you meet a tiger and call him uncle, he will leave you alone." "I'll try and remember that," said Shyam. The buffaloes were now well inside the water, and some of them were lying down in the mud. Buffaloes love soft, wet mud and will wallow in it for hours. The slushier the mud, the better. Ramu, to avoid being dragged down into the mud with his buffalo, slipped off its back and plunged into the water. He waded to a small islet covered with reeds and water lilies. Shyam was close behind him. They lay down on their hard, flat stomachs on a patch of grass and allowed the warm sun to beat down on their bare brown bodies. Ramu was the more knowledgeable boy because he had been to Hardiwar and Dehradun several times with his father. Shyam had never been out of the village. Shyam said, "The pool is not so deep this year." "We have had no rain since January," said Ramu. "If we do not get rain soon, the Jeel may dry up altogether." "And then what will we do?" I don't know. There's a well in the village, but even that may dry up. My father told me that it did once, just about the time I was born, and everyone had to walk 10 miles to the river for water." "And what about the animals?" "Some will stay here and die. Others will go to the river. But there are too many people near the river now, and temples, houses, and factories, so the animals stay away. And the trees have been cut so that between the jungle and the river there is no place to hide. Animals are afraid of the open. They are afraid of men with guns." "Even at night?" "At night men come in jeeps with searchlights. They kill the deer for meat and sell the skins of tigers and panthers." "I didn't know a tiger's skin was worth anything." "It's worth more than our skins," said Ramu knowingly. "It will fetch 600 rupees. Who would pay that much for one of us?" "Our fathers would." "True, if they had the money. If my father sold his fields, he would get more than 600 rupees. "True, but if he sold his fields, none of you would have anything to eat. A man needs land as much as a tiger needs a jungle." "Yes," said Shyam. "And that reminds me, my mother asked me to take some roots home." "I will help you." They walked deeper into the Jeel until the water was up to their waists and began pulling up water lilies by the roots. The flower is beautiful, but the villagers value the root more. When it is cooked, it makes a delicious and nourishing dish. The plant multiples rapidly and is always in good supply. In the year when famine hit the village, it was only the root of the water lily that saved many from starvation. When Shyam and Ramu had finished gathering roots, they emerged from the water and passed the time wrestling with each other, slipping about in the soft mud, which soon covered them from head to toe. To get rid of the mud, they dived into the water again and swam across to their buffaloes. Then, jumping onto their backs and digging their heels into the thick hides, the boys raced them across the Jeel, shouting and hollering so much that all the birds flew away in fright, and the monkeys set up a shrill chattering of their own in the dihak trees. In March, the flame of the forest, or dihak trees, are ablaze with bright scarlet and orange flowers. It was evening, and the twilight was fading fast when the buffalo herd finally wandered its way homeward, to be greeted outside the village by the barking of dogs, the gurgle of hookah pipes, and the homely smell of cow dung smoke. The tiger made a kill that night, a chittle. He made his approach against the wind, so that the unsuspecting spotted deer did not see him until it was too late. A blow on the deer's haunches from the tiger's paw brought it down, and then the great beast fastened his fangs on the deer's throat. It was all over in a few minutes. The tiger was too quick and strong, and the deer did not struggle much. It was a violent end for so gentle a creature. But you must not imagine that in the jungle the deer live in permanent fear of death. It is only man, with his imagination and his fear of the hereafter, who is afraid of dying. In the jungle it is different. Sudden death appears at intervals. Wild creatures do not have to think about it, and so the sudden killing of one of their number by some predator of the forest is only a fleeting incident soon forgotten by the survivors. The tiger feasted well, growling with pleasure as he ate his way up the body, leaving the entrails. When he had had his night's fill, he left the carcass for the vultures and jackals. The cunning old tiger never returned to the same carcass, even if there was still plenty left to eat. In the past, when he had gone back to a kill, he had often found a man sitting in a tree waiting for him with a rifle. His belly filled, the tiger sauntered over to the edge of the forest and looked out across the sandy wasteland and the deep, singing river at the twinkling lights of E46 on the opposite bank, and raised his head and roared his defiance at mankind. He was a lonesome bachelor. It was 5 or 6 years since he had a mate. She had been shot by the trophy hunters, and her 2 cubs had been trapped by men who do trade in wild animals. One went to a circus, where he had to learn tricks to amuse men and respond to the crack of a whip. The other, more fortunate, went first to a zoo in Delhi, and was later transferred to a zoo in America. Sometimes, when the old tiger was very lonely, he gave a great roar, which could be heard throughout the forest. The villagers thought he was roaring in anger, but the jungle knew that he was really roaring out of loneliness. When the sound of his roar had died away, he paused, standing still, waiting for an answering roar, but it never came. It was taken up instead by the shrill scream of a barbet high up in a sal tree. It was dawn now, dew fresh and cool, and the jungle dwellers were on the move. The black, beady little eyes of a jungle rat were fixed on a brown hen who was pecking around in the undergrowth near her nest. He had a large family to feed, this rat, and he knew that in the hen's nest was a clutch of delicious fawn-colored eggs. He waited patiently for nearly an hour before he had the satisfaction of seeing the hen leave her nest and go off in search of food. As soon as she had gone, the rat lost no time in making his raid. Slipping quietly out of his hole, he slithered along among the leaves, but, clever as he was, he did not realize that his own movements were being watched. A pair of gray mongooses scouted about in the dry grass. They too were hungry, and eggs usually figured large on their menu. Now, lying still on an outcrop of rock, they watched the rat sneaking along, occasionally sniffing at the air and finally vanishing behind a boulder. When he reappeared, he was struggling to roll an egg uphill towards his hole. The rat was in difficulty, pushing the egg sometimes with his paws, sometimes with his nose. The ground was rough, and the egg wouldn't move straight. Deciding that he must have help, he scuttled off to call his spouse. Even now, the mongooses did not descend on the tantalizing egg. They waited until the rat returned with his wife, and then watched as the male rat took the egg firmly between his forepaws and rolled over onto his back. The female rat then grabbed her mate's tail and began to drag him along. Totally absorbed in the struggle with the egg, the rat did not hear the approach of the mongooses. When these 2 large furry visitors suddenly bobbed up from behind a stone, the rats squealed with fright, abandoned the egg, and fled for their lives. The mongooses wasted no time in breaking open the egg and making a meal of it. But just as, a few minutes ago, the rat had not noticed their approach, so now they did not notice the village boy, carrying a small bright axe and a net bag in his hands, creeping along. Ramu too was searching for eggs, and when he saw the mongooses busy with one, he stood still to watch them, his eyes roving in search of the nest. He was hoping the mongooses would lead him to the nest, but when they had finished their meal and made off into the undergrowth, Ramu had to do his own searching. He failed to find the nest and moved further into the forest. The rat's hopes were just reviving when, to his disgust, the mother hen returned. Ramu now made his way to a mahua tree. The flowers of the mahua can be eaten by animals as well as by men. Bears are particularly fond of them and will eat large quantities of flowers, which gradually start fermenting in their stomachs, with the result that the animals get quite drunk. Ramu had often seen a couple of bears stumbling home to their cave, bumping into each other or into the trunks of trees. They are short-sighted to begin with, and when drunk can hardly see at all. But their sense of smell and hearing are so good that in the end they find their way home. Ramu decided he would gather some mahua flowers and climbed up the tree, which is leafless when it blossoms. He began breaking the white flowers and throwing them to the ground. He had been on the tree for about 5 minutes when he heard the whining grumble of a bear, and presently a young sloth bear ambled into the clearing beneath the tree. He was a small bear, little more than a cub, and Ramu was not frightened, but, because he thought the mother might be in the vicinity, he decided to take no chances and sat very still, waiting to see what the bear would do. He hoped it wouldn't choose the mahua tree for a meal. At first, the young bear put his nose to the ground and sniffed his way along until he came to a large anthill. Here he began huffing and puffing, blowing rapidly in and out of his nostrils, causing the dust from the anthill to fly in all directions. But he was a disappointed bear, because the anthill had been deserted long ago. And so, grumbling, he made his way across to a tall wild plum tree, and shinning rapidly up the smooth trunk, was soon perched on its topmost branches. It was only then that he saw Ramu. The bear at once scrambled several feet higher up the tree and laid himself out flat on a branch. It wasn't a very thick branch, and left a large expanse of bare showing on either side. The bear tucked his head away behind another branch, and so long as he could not see Ramu, seemed quite satisfied that he was well hidden, though he couldn't help grumbling with anxiety, for a bear, like most animals, is afraid of man. Bears, however, are also very curious, and curiosity has often led them into trouble. Slowly, inch by inch, the young bear's black snout appeared over the edge of the branch, but as soon as the eyes came into view and met Ramu's, he drew back with a jerk, and the head was once more hidden. The bear did this 2 or 3 times, and Ramu, highly amused, waited until it wasn't looking, then moved some way down the tree. When the bear looked up again and saw that the boy was missing, he was so pleased with himself that he stretched right across to the next branch to get a plum. Ramu chose this moment to burst into loud laughter. The startled bear tumbled out of the tree, dropped through the branches for a distance of some 15 feet, and landed with a thud in a heap of dry leaves. And then several things happened at almost the same time. The mother bear came charging into the clearing. Spotting Ramu in the tree, she reared up on her hind legs, grunting fiercely. It was Ramu's turn to be startled. There are few animals more dangerous than a rampaging mother bear, and the boy knew that one blow from her clawed forepaws could rip his skull open. But before the bear could approach the tree, there was a tremendous roar, and the old tiger bounded into the clearing. He had been asleep in the bushes not far away. He liked a good sleep after a heavy meal, and the noise in the clearing had woken him. He was in a bad mood, and his loud "Aoon" made his displeasure quite clear. The bears turned and ran from the clearing, the youngster squealing with fright. The tiger then came into the center of the clearing, looked up at the trembling boy, and roared again. Ramu nearly fell out of the tree. "Good day to you, uncle," he stammered, showing his teeth in a nervous grin. Perhaps this was too much for the tiger. With a low growl, he turned his back on the mahua tree and padded off into the jungle, his tail twitching in disgust. That night, when Ramu told his parents and his grandfather about the tiger and how he had saved him from a female bear, it started a round of tiger stories, about how some of them could be gentlemen, others rogues. Sooner or later the conversation came round to man-eaters, and grandfather told 2 stories which he swore were true, although his listeners only half believed him. The first story concerned the belief that a man-eating tiger is guided towards his next victim by the spirit of a human being previously killed and eaten by the tiger. Grandfather said that he actually knew 3 hunters who sat up in a matchin over a human kill, and when the tiger came, the corpse sat up and pointed with his right hand at the men in the tree. The tiger then went away. But the hunters knew he would return, and one man was brave enough to get down from the tree and tie the right arm of the corpse to its side. Later, when the tiger returned, the corpse sat up and this time pointed at the man with his left hand. The enraged tiger sprang into the tree and killed his enemies in the matchin. And then there was a Bania, said Grandfather, beginning another story, who lived in a village in the jungle. He wanted to visit a neighboring village to collect some money that was owed to him, but as the road lay through heavy forest in which lived a terrible man-eating tiger, he did not know what to do. Finally, he went to a sadhu, who gave him 2 powders. By eating the first powder, he could turn into a huge tiger, capable of dealing with any other tiger in the jungle, and by eating the second, he would become a Bania again. Armed with his 2 powders and accompanied by his pretty young wife, the Bania set out on his journey. They had not gone far into the forest when they came upon the man-eater sitting in the middle of the road. Before swallowing the first powder, the Bania told his wife to stay where she was, so that when he returned after killing the tiger, she could at once give him the second powder and enable him to resume his old shape. Well, the Bania's plan worked, but only up to a point. He swallowed the first powder and immediately became a magnificent tiger. With a great roar, he bounded towards the man-eater, and after a brief, furious fight, killed his opponent. Then, with his jaws still dripping blood, he returned to his wife. The poor girl was terrified and spilt the second powder on the ground. The Bania was so angry that he pounced on his wife and killed and ate her. And afterwards, this terrible tiger was so enraged at not being able to become a human again that he killed and ate hundreds of people all over the country. The only people he spared, added Grandfather with a twinkle in his eyes, were those who owed him money. A Bania never gives up a loan as lost, and the tiger still hoped that one day he might become a human again and be able to collect his dues. Next morning, when Ramu came back from the well which was used to irrigate his father's fields, he found a crowd of curious children surrounding a jeep and 3 strangers with guns. Each of the strangers had a gun, and they were accompanied by 2 bearers and a vast amount of provisions. They had heard that there was a tiger in the area, and they wanted to shoot it. One of the hunters, who looked even more strange than the others, had come all the way from America to shoot a tiger, and he vowed that he would not leave the country without a tiger's skin in his baggage. One of his companions had said that he could buy a tiger's skin in Delhi, but the hunter said he preferred to get his own trophies. These men had money to spend, and as most of the villagers needed money badly, they were only too willing to go into the forest to construct a matchin for the hunters. The platform, big enough to take the 3 men, was put up in the branches of a tall tun, or mahogany, tree. It was the only night the hunters used the matchin. At the end of March, though the days are warm, the nights are still cold. The hunters had neglected to bring blankets, and by midnight their teeth were chattering. Ramu, having tied up a buffalo calf for them at the foot of the tree, made as if to go home, but instead circled the area, hanging up bits and pieces of old clothing on small trees and bushes. He thought he owed that much to the tiger. He knew the wily old king of the jungle would keep well away from the bait if he saw the bits of clothing, for where there were men's clothes, there would be men. The vigil lasted well into the night, but the tiger did not come near the tun tree. Perhaps he wasn't hungry, perhaps he got Ramu's message. In any case, the men in the tree soon gave themselves away. The cold was really too much for them. A flask of rum was produced and passed round, and it was not long before there was more purpose to finishing the rum than to finishing off a tiger. Silent at first, The men soon began talking in whispers, and to jungle creatures, a human whisper is as telling as a trumpet call. Soon the men were quite merry, talking in loud voices. And when the first morning light crept over the forest, and Ramu and his friends came back to fetch the great hunters, they found them fast asleep in the mansion. The hunters looked surly and embarrassed as they trudged back to the village. "No game left in these parts," said the American. "Wrong time of the year for tiger," said the second man. "Don't know what the country's coming to," said the third. And complaining about the weather, the poor quality of cartridges, the quantity of rum they had drunk, and the perversity of tigers, they drove away in disgust. It was not until the onset of summer that an event occurred which altered the hunting habits of the old tiger and brought him into conflict with the villagers. There had been no rain for almost 2 months, and the tall jungle grass had become a sea of billowy dry yellow. Some refugee settlers, living in an area where the forest had been cleared, had been careless while cooking and had started a jungle fire. Slowly it spread into the interior, from where the acrid smell and the fumes smoked the tiger out towards the edge of the jungle. As night came on, the flames grew more vivid and the smell stronger. The tiger turned and made for the Jeel, where he knew he would be safe provided he swam across to the little island in the center. Next morning he was on the island, which was untouched by the fire. But his surroundings had changed. The slopes of the hills were black with burnt grass, and most of the tall bamboo had disappeared. The deer and the wild pig, finding that their natural cover had gone, fled further east. When the fire had died down and the smoke had cleared, the tiger prowled through the forest again, but found no game. Once he came across the body of a burnt rabbit, but he could not eat it. He drank at the Jeel and settled down in a shady spot to sleep the day away. Perhaps by evening, some of the animals would return. If not, he too would have to look for new hunting grounds or new game. The tiger spent 5 more days looking for suitable game to kill. By that time he was so hungry that he even resorted to rooting among the dead leaves and burned out stumps of trees, searching for worms and beetles. This was a sad come-down for the king of the jungle. But even now he hesitated to leave the area, for he had a deep suspicion and fear of the forest further east, forests that were fast being swallowed up by human habitation. He could have gone north into high mountains, but they did not provide him with the long grass he needed. A panther could manage quite well up there, but not a tiger, who loved the natural privacy of the heavy jungle. In the hills, he would have to hide all the time. At break of day, the tiger came to the Jeel. The water was now shallow and muddy, and a green scum had spread over the top. But it was still drinkable, and the tiger quenched his thirst. He lay down across his favorite rock, hoping for a deer, but none came. He was about to get up and go away when he heard an animal approach. The tiger at once leaped off his perch and flattened himself on the ground, his tawny striped skin merging with the dry grass. A heavy animal was moving through the bushes, and the tiger waited patiently. A buffalo emerged and came to the water. The buffalo was alone. He was a big male, and his long curved horns lay right back across his shoulders. He moved leisurely towards the water, completely unaware of the tiger's presence. The tiger hesitated before making his charge. It was a long time, many years, since he had killed a buffalo, and he knew the villagers would not like it. But the pangs of hunger overcame his scruples. There was no morning breeze, everything was still, and the smell of the tiger did not reach the buffalo. A monkey chattered on a nearby tree, but his warning went unheeded. Crawling stealthily on his stomach, the tiger skirted the edge of the Jeel and approached the buffalo from the rear. The water birds, who were used to the presence of both animals, did not raise an alarm. Getting closer, the tiger glanced around to see if there were men or other buffaloes in the vicinity. Then, satisfied that he was alone, he crept forward. The buffalo was drinking, standing in shallow water at the edge of the geel, when the tiger charged from the side and bit deep into the animal's thigh. The buffalo turned to fight, but the tendons of his right hind leg had been snapped, and he could only stagger forward a few paces. But he was a buffalo, the bravest of the domestic cattle. He was not afraid. He snorted and lowered his horns at the tiger, but the great cat was too fast and, circling the buffalo, bit into the other hind leg. The buffalo crashed to the ground, both hind legs crippled, and then the tiger dashed in, using both tooth and claw, biting deep into the buffalo's throat until the blood gushed out from the jugular vein. The buffalo gave one long, last bellow before dying. The tiger, having rested, now began to gorge himself, but even though he had been starving for days, he could not finish the huge carcass. At least one good meal still remained when, satisfied and feeling his strength returning, he quenched his thirst at the geel. Then he dragged the remains of the buffalo into the bushes to hide it from the vultures, and went off to find a place to sleep. He would return to the kill when he was hungry. The villagers were upset when they discovered that a buffalo was missing, and the next day, when Ramu and Shyam came running home to say that they had found the carcass near the geel, half eaten by a tiger, the men were disturbed and angry. They felt that the tiger had tricked and deceived them, and they knew that once he got a taste for domestic cattle, he would make a habit of slaughtering them. Kundan Singh, Shyam's father and the owner of the dead buffalo, said he would go after the tiger himself. "It is all very well to talk about what you will do to the tiger," said his wife, "but you should never have let the buffalo go off on its own." "He had been out on his own before," said Kundan. "This is the first time the tiger has attacked one of our beasts. A devil must have entered the Maharaja." "He must have been very hungry," said Shyam. "Well, we are hungry too," said Kundan Singh. "Our best buffalo, the only male in our herd." "The tiger will kill again," said Ramu's father. "If we let him," said Kundan. "Should we send for the shikaris?" No. They were not clever. The tiger will escape them easily. Besides, there is no time. The tiger will return for another meal tonight. We must finish him off ourselves. "But how?" Kundan Singh smiled secretively, played with the ends of his mustache for a few moments, and then, with great pride, produced from under his cot a double-barreled gun of ancient vintage. "My father bought it from an Englishman," he said. "How long ago was that?" "At the time I was born." "And have you ever used it?" asked Ramu's father, who was not sure that the gun would work. "Well, some years back I let it off at some bandits. You remember the time when those dacoits raided our village? They chose the wrong village and were severely beaten for their pains. As they left, I fired my gun off at them. They didn't stop running until they crossed the Ganga." "Yes, but did you hit anyone?" "I would have, if someone's goat hadn't got in the way at the last moment. But we had roast mutton that night. Don't worry, brother, I know how the thing fires." Accompanied by Ramu's father and some others, Kundan Singh set out for the geel, where, without shifting the buffalo's carcass, for they knew that the tiger would not come near them if he suspected a trap, they made another machin in the branches of a tall tree some 30 feet from the kill. Later that evening, Kundan Singh and Ramu's father settled down for the night on their crude platform in the tree. Several hours passed, and nothing but a jackal was seen by the watchers. And then, just as the moon came up over the distant hills, Kundun and his companion were startled by a low "Ayun," followed by a suppressed, rumbling growl. Kundun grasped his old gun, whilst his friend drew closer to him for comfort. There was complete silence for a minute or two, time that was an agony of suspense for the watchers, and then the sound of stealthy footfalls on dead leaves under the trees. A moment later, the tiger walked out into the moonlight and stood over his kill. At first, Kundun could do nothing. He was completely overawed by the size of this magnificent tiger. Ramu's father had to nudge him, and then Kundun quickly put the gun to his shoulder, aimed at the tiger's head, and pressed the trigger. The gun went off with a flash and two loud bangs, as Kundun fired both barrels. Then there was a tremendous roar. One of the bullets had grazed the tiger's head. The enraged animal rushed at the tree and tried to leap up into the branches. Fortunately, the machin had been built at a safe height, and the tiger was unable to reach it. He roared again and then bounded off into the forest. "What a tiger!" exclaimed Kundun, half in fear and half in admiration. "I feel as though my liver has turned to water." "You missed him completely," said Ramu's father. "Your gun makes a big noise. An arrow would have done more damage." "I did not miss him," said Kundun, feeling offended. "You heard him roar, didn't you? Would he have been so angry if he had not been hit? If I have wounded him badly, he will die. And if you have wounded him slightly, he may turn into a man-eater, and then where will we be?" "I don't think he will come back," said Kundun. "He will leave these forests." They waited until the sun was up before coming down from the tree. They found a few drops of blood on the dry grass, but no trail led into the forest, and Ramu's father was convinced that the wound was only a slight one. The bullet, missing the fatal spot behind the ear, had only grazed the back of the skull and cut a deep groove at its base. It took a few days to heal, and during this time the tiger lay low and did not go near the jail except when it was very dark and he was very thirsty. The villagers thought the tiger had gone away, and Ramu and Shyam, accompanied by some other youths and always carrying axes and lethais, began bringing buffaloes to the jail again during the day, but they were careful not to let any of them stray far from the herd, and they returned home while it was still daylight. It was some days since the jungle had been ravaged by the fire, and in the tropics the damage is repaired quickly. In spite of it being the dry season, new life was creeping into the forest. While the buffaloes wallowed in the muddy water and the boys wrestled on the grassy island, a big tawny eagle soared high above them, looking for a meal, a sure sign that some of the animals were beginning to return to the forest. It was not long before his keen eyes detected a movement in the glade below. What the eagle with his powerful eyesight saw was a baby hare, a small fluffy thing, its long pink-tinted ears laid flat along its sides. Had it not been creeping along between two large stones, it would have escaped notice. The eagle waited to see if the mother was about, and as he waited, he realized that he was not the only one who coveted this juicy morsel. From the bushes there had appeared a sinuous yellow creature, pressed low to the ground and moving rapidly towards the hare. It was a yellow jungle cat, hardly noticeable in the scorched grass. With great stealth, the jungle cat began to stalk the baby hare. He pounced. The hare's squeal was cut short by the cat's cruel claws, but it had been heard by the mother hare, who now bounded into the glade and without the slightest hesitation went for the surprised cat. There was nothing haphazard about the mother hare's attack. She flashed around behind the cat and jumped clean over him. As she landed, she kicked back, sending a stinging jet of dust shooting into the cat's face. She did this again and again. The bewildered cat, crouching and snarling, picked up the kill and tried to run away with it. But the hare would not permit this. She continued her leaping and buffeting, till eventually the cat, out of sheer frustration, dropped the kill, and attacked the mother. The cat sprang at the hare a score of times, lashing out with his claws, but the mother hare was both clever and agile enough to keep just out of reach of those terrible claws and drew the cat further and further away from her baby, for she did not as yet know that it was dead. The tawny eagle saw his chance. Swift and true, he swooped. For a brief moment, as his wings overspread the furry small little hare, and his talons sank deep into it, he caught a glimpse of the cat racing towards him and the mother hare fleeing into the bushes. And then, with a shrill "kee" of triumph, he rose and whirled away with his dinner. The boys had heard his shrill cry and looked up just in time to see the eagle flying over the geel with the little hare held firmly in his talons. "Poor hare," said Shyam. "Its life was short." "That's the law of the jungle," said Ramu. "The eagle has a family too, and must feed it." "I wonder if we are any better than animals," said Shyam. "Perhaps we are a little better in some ways," said Ramu. "Grandfather always says, to be able to laugh and to be merciful are the only things that make man better than the beast." The next day, while the boys were taking the herd home, one of the buffaloes lagged behind. Ramu did not realize that the animal was missing until he heard an agonized bellow behind him. He glanced over his shoulder just in time to see the big striped tiger dragging the buffalo into a clump of young bamboo. At the same time, the herd became aware of the danger, and the buffaloes snorted with fear as they hurried along the forest path. To urge them forward and to warn his friends, Ramu cupped his hands to his mouth and gave vent to a yodeling call. The buffaloes bellowed, the boys shouted, and the birds flew shrieking from the trees. It was almost a stampede by the time the herd emerged from the forest. The villagers heard the thunder of hoofs and saw the herd coming home amidst clouds of dust and confusion, and knew that something was wrong. "The tiger!" shouted Ramu. "He is here. He has killed one of the buffaloes." "He is afraid of us no longer," said Shyam. "Did you see where he went?" asked Kundan Singh, hurrying up to them. "I remember the place," said Ramu. "He dragged the buffalo in amongst the bamboo." "Then there is no time to lose," said his father. "Kundan, you take your gun and 2 men, and wait near the suspension bridge where the Garur stream joins the Ganga. The jungle is narrow there. We will beat the jungle from our side and drive the tiger towards you. He will not escape us unless he swims the river." "Good," said Kundan Singh, running into his house for his gun, with Shyam close at his heels. "Was it one of our buffaloes again?" he asked. "It was Ramu's buffalo this time," said Shyam. "A good milk buffalo." "Then Ramu's father will beat the jungle thoroughly. You boys had better come with me. It will not be safe for you to accompany the beaters." Kundan Singh, carrying his gun and accompanied by Ramu, Shyam, and 2 men, headed for the river junction, while Ramu's father collected about 20 men from the village and, guided by one of the boys who had been with Ramu, made for the spot where the tiger had killed the buffalo. The tiger was still eating when he heard the men coming. He had not expected to be disturbed so soon. With an angry "woof," he bounded into a bamboo thicket and watched the men through a screen of leaves and tall grass. The men did not seem to take much notice of the dead buffalo, but gathered round their leader and held a consultation. Most of them carried hand drums slung from their shoulders. They also carried sticks, spears, and axes. After a hurried conversation, they entered the denser part of the jungle, beating their drums with the palms of their hands. Some of the men banged empty kerosene tins. These made even more noise than the drums. The tiger did not like the noise and retreated deeper into the jungle. But he was surprised to find that the men, instead of going away, came after him into the jungle, banging away on their drums and tins and shouting at the top of their voices. They had separated now and advanced single or in pairs, but nowhere were they more than 15 yards apart. The tiger could easily have broken through this slowly advancing semicircle of men. One swift blow from his paw would have felled the strongest of them, but his main aim was to get away from the noise. He hated and feared noise made by men. He was not a man-eater, and he would not attack a man unless he was very angry or frightened or very desperate, and he was none of these things as yet. He had eaten well, and he would have liked to rest in peace, but there would be no rest for any animal until the men ceased their tremendous clatter and din. For an hour, Ramu's father and the others beat the jungle, calling, drumming, and trampling the undergrowth. The tiger had no rest. Whenever he was able to put some distance between himself and the men, he would sink down in some shady spot to rest, but within 5 or 10 minutes, the trampling and drumming would sound nearer, and the tiger, with an angry snarl, would get up and pad silently north along the narrowing strip of jungle towards the junction of the Gurur stream and the Ganga. 10 years ago, he would have had the jungle on his right in which to hide, but the trees had been felled long ago to make way for humans and houses, and now he could only move to the left towards the river. It was about noon when the tiger finally appeared in the open. He longed for the darkness and security of the night, for the sun was his enemy. Kundan and the boys had a clear view of him as he stalked slowly along, now in the open with the sun glinting on his glossy hide, now in the shade or passing through the shorter reeds. He was still out of range of Kundan's gun, but there was no fear of his getting out of the beat, as the stops were all picked men from the village. He disappeared among some bushes, but soon reappeared to retrace his steps, the beaters having done their work well. He was now only 150 yards from the rocks where Kundan Singh waited, and he looked very big. The beat had closed in, and the exit along the bank downstream was completely blocked, so the tiger turned and disappeared into a belt of reeds, and Kundan Singh expected that the head would soon peer out of the cover a few yards away. The beaters were now making a great noise, shouting and beating their drums, but nothing moved, and Ramu, watching from a distance, wondered, has he slipped through the beaters? And he half hoped so. Tins clashed, drums beat, and some of the men poked into the reeds with their spears or long bamboos. Perhaps one of these thrusts found a mark, because at last the tiger was roused, and with an angry, desperate snarl, he charged out of the reeds, splashing his way through an inlet of mud and water. Kundan Singh fired, and his bullet struck the tiger on the thigh. The mighty animal stumbled, but he was up in a minute, and rushing through a gap in the narrowing line of beaters, he made straight for the only way across the river, the suspension bridge that passed over the Ganga here, providing a route into the high hills beyond. "We'll get him now," said Kundan, priming his gun again. "He's right in the open." The suspension bridge swayed and trembled as the wounded tiger lurched across it. Kundan fired, and this time the bullet grazed the tiger's shoulder. The animal bounded forward, lost his footing on the unfamiliar, slippery planks of the swaying bridge, and went over the side, falling headlong into the strong, swirling waters of the river. He rose to the surface once, but the current took him under and away, and only a thin streak of blood remained on the river's surface. Kundan and others hurried downstream to see if the dead tiger had been washed up on the river's banks, but though they searched the riverside for several miles, they did not find the king of the forest. He had not provided anyone with a trophy. His skin would not be spread on a couch, nor would his head be hung up on a wall. No claw of his would be hung as a charm round the neck of a child. No villager would use his fat as a cure for rheumatism. At first the villagers were glad because they felt their buffaloes were safe. Then the men began to feel that something had gone out of their lives, out of the life of the forest. They began to feel that the forest was no longer a forest. It had been shrinking year by year, But as long as the tiger had been there, and the villagers had heard it roar at night, they had known that they were still secure from the intruders and newcomers who came to fell the trees and eat up the land and let the flood waters into the village. But now that the tiger had gone, it was as though a protector had gone, leaving the forest open and vulnerable, easily destroyable. And once the forest was destroyed, they too would be in danger. There was another thing that had gone with the tiger, another thing that had been lost, a thing that was being lost everywhere, something called nobility. Ramu remembered something that his grandfather had once said. The tiger is the very soul of India, and when the last tiger goes, so will the soul of the country. The boys lay flat on their stomachs on their little mud island and watched the monsoon clouds gathering overhead. The king of our forest is dead, said Shyam. There are no more tigers. There must be tigers, said Ramu. How can there be an India without tigers? The river had carried the tiger many miles away from his home, from the forest he had always known, and brought him ashore on a strip of warm yellow sand, where he lay in the sun, quite still, but breathing. Vultures gathered and waited at a distance, some of them perching on the branches of nearby trees. But the tiger was more drowned than hurt, and as the river water oozed out of his mouth and the warm sun made new life throb through his body, he stirred and stretched, and his glazed eyes came into focus. Raising his head, he saw trees and tall grass. Slowly he heaved himself off the ground and moved at a crouch to where the grass waved in the afternoon breeze. Would he be harried again and shot at? There was no smell of man. The tiger moved forward with greater confidence. There was, however, another smell in the air, a smell that reached back to the time when he was young and fresh and full of vigor, a smell that he had almost forgotten but could never quite forget, the smell of a tigress. He raised his head high, and new life surged through his tired limbs. He gave a full-throated roar and moved purposefully through the tall grass. And the roar came back to him, calling him forward, a roar that meant there would be more tigers in the land. 2. Grammar page.